President Biden announced Wednesday that the U.S. will withdraw all troops from Afghanistan before September 11th. Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby says despite the action, the U.S. will not stop supporting the Afghan government in its fight against the Taliban.
Our military mission in Afghanistan is coming to a close. We will continue to maintain the kinds of capabilities necessary, sufficient, to prevent terrorist attacks on the homeland emanating from Afghanistan. But the Afghan National Security Forces are right now defending their own people, securing their own borders. And they will continue to do that. And our support for them, while it will shift, it transitions from, being boots on the ground advisors, it will shift from that to a measure of support for their efforts going forward.
Right now, the U.S. has about 2,500 troops in Afghanistan who are publicly acknowledged. That number will grow temporarily as the Pentagon sends hundreds more to the region to assist with the withdrawal. Former President Trump had previously set May 1st as the deadline to leave Afghanistan. The Taliban has threatened, quote, compounded problems for President Biden if he does not stick to that timeline. With me now for more is Ben Anderson. Ben is a senior producer and correspondent for Vice, and he's also the author of No Worse Enemy, the inside story of the chaotic struggle for Afghanistan. Ben, good to have you on this show. I want to start off by discussing those two deadlines. What was behind President Biden's September 11th deadline? And what are the concerns now that the U.S. does not plan to follow the May 1st withdrawal deadline that was issued by former President Trump?
The Taliban have said they won't accept the later withdrawal date, so it's unclear what that means. It could mean that the Taliban start once again attacking U.S. forces. As to Biden's selection as September 11th as the date, it's curious. The only reason I can think of is it's a reminder that the reason we went in there was to stop Afghanistan once again being a place where, terrorist groups could plan attacks against the West. And that goal was largely achieved a very, very long time ago. The other, much more complicated goals haven't been achieved, but I think Biden is saying we never will achieve those. So it's time to essentially give up and come home.
So as far as your understanding of it is, there's no reason, though, to have shifted that deadline back by about 4 months that President Trump had initially offered, except the symbolism of September 11th. Am I understanding you correctly?
I mean, removing the 2,500 troops is difficult. My only other guess would be that in order to prevent groups like Al-Qaeda having bases in Afghanistan, and in order to stop the Taliban taking major cities, and maybe even Kabul, which they've nearly taken several other major cities in Afghanistan many times. The only reason that hasn't happened is because U.S. special forces have been able to call in airstrikes. So possibly that capability needs to be ramped up or adapted given the removal of conventional forces. That may take a bit more time than the May 1st deadline would allow.
Well, even after September 11th, the U.S. still wants to hold influence in Afghanistan. So, Ben, how does the Biden administration actually plan to do that?
And it's interesting. Everyone's talking about this withdrawal as if it's a total withdrawal. The 2,500 conventional troops that are being withdrawn, I don't think will make a huge difference. What will make a huge difference is if we stop funding the Afghan government and its security forces. Desertion and defection rates amongst them are already unsustainably high. If we stop paying the salaries of those security forces, the Afghan government can't come close to paying those salaries itself. That will lead to far more desertions and defections, and that will give huge power to the Taliban.
Well, the U.S. and our allies have invested heavily in Afghanistan, but still have had mixed success when it comes to enlisting support of the Afghan people over the past 20 years in the country. How is this withdrawal announcement being perceived, and what does the future look like for the people of Afghanistan?
I mean, most Afghans I've spoken to, they're aware that there's an agreement between the U.S. government and the Taliban, but not between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So they are effectively being asked to trust the Taliban to negotiate in good faith and reach an agreement with the Afghan government, and hopefully then to protect the somewhat spotty progress that has been made on things like democracy, freedom of the press, women's rights, And I think pretty much every Afghan I've spoken to and know would say they absolutely do not trust the Taliban whatsoever. So if we really withdraw without being able to pressure the Taliban in any meaningful way, most Afghans are terrified about what that means for their future in Afghanistan.
Following along this same thread, do you believe that there will be a surge of Islamic extremism when the U.S. leaves? And are Afghan troops really prepared to fight this battle?
I mean, it depends what you mean when you say Islamic extremism. I mean, in terms of women's rights, for example, that I just mentioned, too many of the Afghans we've supported in positions of power don't have a huge disagreement with the Taliban on women's rights, for example. If you mean terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I think one of the few concessions the Taliban would genuinely be willing to give is not to allow Afghanistan to be a base from which groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS could plan attacks on the West once again. They don't seem to be too interested in what happens outside of the borders of Afghanistan. And also, I think they realize that's really the only reason they lost power in the first place. So even just for selfish reasons, I think they might be willing to enforce that. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't really need a base in Afghanistan anymore. I mean, they have many bases in Africa, for example. Just yesterday, ISIS claimed credit for a huge attack in Nigeria. So I know many people are saying Afghanistan could very quickly once again become a place where groups like Al-Qaeda plan and launch attacks against the West. I think that's less of a likely possibility.
But it's an important distinction that you're making about our concept of Islamic extremism as a threat to the United States in terms of terrorist attacks and this global war, for lack of a better word, that's happening, and the other ideas of Afghanistan becoming increasingly insular and not being open to women's rights and democratic progress in the area. You've spent so much time on the ground in Afghanistan, Ben, over the past couple of decades. Was there ever a time when the United States could have definitively won this war? And how do U.S. troops deal with the idea that there was no real victory?
I mean, I think with any foreign intervention like Afghanistan, your window for success is very, very brief. And we didn't really take nation building in Afghanistan seriously until 2007, 2008 onwards. I'm somewhat in the minority here in that I think that if on day one we would have, made the Taliban part of the talks, and they were willing to be part of the talks, and they had very humble demands for being part of the talks at that point because they had been largely defeated. And if we'd been willing to listen to those many Afghans, particularly younger Afghans, who did want democracy, rule of law, freedom of the press, and women's rights, if we'd have listened to them and supported them instead of the worst of the warlords and corrupt officials from Afghanistan's recent history, then I think things would have looked radically different today. But I think partly in the rush to get to Iraq, we just handed power back to those people who had power and guns. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we've since then failed so miserably. I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that after that initial period of the first few years, one of the biggest achievements of the last 17, 18 years, and 100,000 plus lives lost, mostly Afghan, well over $1 trillion spent. One of the main achievements has been to greatly weaken the Afghan government and the US's position at the negotiating table and greatly strengthen the position of the Taliban, which is damning when you think about it like that.
Ben Anderson, thank you for joining us to share your insights.
Thank you.